The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth European Students for Liberty webinar of this series. Today we have Dr. Phil Magness. He's an academic program director at IHS. If you do not know about IHS, make sure you check them out. They do amazing stuff. He is a policy historian, and he has written a lot of blogs on the recent book of Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. And he will now analyze all the data Piketty uses to see if his main thesis is still correct. So I will now give the internet floor to Dr. Phil Magness.
All right, thanks, Davey, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, although I guess it's evening over in Europe. As Davey mentioned, I'm actually a historian by training, so I'm coming at what is really an economic book from a somewhat unique, somewhat unusual angle given the commentary that it's generated, although there has been quite a bit of commentary. I want to briefly summarize, I guess, some of the main points of the book and kind of illustrate where my argument is coming from. Those of you that have seen some of the news about Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, or possibly even read the book yourself, although it's a huge 700-page tome, so it's quite a bit of energy will be expended if you actually do read it. It breaks down, though, essentially into three lines of argument, and they kind of depend on each other. They interrelate to one another. I'm going to focus on one of these in particular, but also talk on how it relates to the others. The general overview of the book is its theory, and many of you may have seen this famous equation. It's R is greater than G. It's basically a way of saying that he expects that in a capitalist system, capitalist economy, that the return on capital, basically investments, will exceed the rate of growth of the economy over time. And when that happens, it creates a situation that will lead to upward expanding wealth inequality. And this is due to the emergence of basically what he calls a rentier or capitalist owning class that survives and lives off of the income of its ownership rather than contributing productively to the economy in active economic production. The result is a growing disparity that he predicts basically over time, and he has some historical events that are tied to that. So this is where history and really data come into his argument. He looks at the 20th century in particular, and he notes that at the very end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century across the world, or at least where he has data, there were very high levels of wealth inequality. The richest 5%, 2%, 1% own massive amounts of the productive sectors of the economy and also massive amounts of wealth. So all these different metrics he utilizes, he brings to bear, show massive wealth inequality at the beginning of the 20th century. Then he argues that certain events early in the 20th century, in particular World War I, World War II, the Great Depression to some extent, and then policies that were enacted in those periods caused a very rapid kind of dissolution of the capital stock that had equalizing effects that followed along with it. Throughout the mid to probably the last quarter or so of the 20th century, you have this equalizing trend at play, and then the general argument is that we're back on the upswing. In other words, we're headed straight for the Gilded Age again. And this is a phrase that he uses throughout the book, that we are about to encounter late 19th century patterns of inequality that previously have not been seen for the better part of a century. And he says that he has all the historical data to back this up. And he jumps from his historical data argument to a prescriptive argument. And this is probably the most famous and controversial element of the book. He says that because of this trend, and because inequality is bad, and he gives a bunch of different reasons why he considers wealth inequality a bad thing. But he says because of this trend, we need to take a conscious policy action, a policy intervention to correct it, to prevent the return of the Gilded Age. And this is an argument for prescriptive, heavy, progressive income and estate taxation, basically to impede the reconstitution of this old Gilded Age style rentier capital stock that previously plagued economic encounters at the beginning of the 20th century. And he gives a variety of reasons. why he thinks this is so. Probably the most famous being he argues for a global wealth tax, basically a global income tax on the highest levels of income earners. Now, several people have critiqued various aspects of these different components of Piketty's argument. I'm going to focus on the middle one, the history here. Others have gone after his theoretical suppositions, both the R is greater than G equation and other aspects underlying that. Some people have also critiqued the intended effects of the progressive income tax. They said basically it'd be an economy killer for a variety of reasons. But I'm arguing that everything essentially turns on the history and really the data that's involved in the history. And I'll defer to Piketty himself on this. He really says that data is the key to everything because data is the validation of the theory in his argument, and it's also the basis on which he makes his prescriptive claims. And he does this very boldly at the outset of his book. There's a quote you can read for yourself, but he basically says that here in my book, I have brought together the most extensive historical and comparative data set that we've ever been able to assemble on the matter of wealth inequality. And he says this is data that covers 3 centuries, more than 20 countries. It's basically a global data set, and applies it to this new theoretical framework that gives us a better understanding of this issue than anyone before us ever has. He's also quite uncharitable when he makes this claim. You know, he repeats the claim about his own data and how great it is throughout the book. There's a little bit of humility tied in, but he always reverts back to say, I have better data than anyone else before me who studied this issue. He also piles on to his intellectual critics and some of his forebears that have been more skeptical about the centrality of inequality in the discussion. And there are some quotes straight out of the book where you can see him being very uncharitable. He's saying the intellectual and political debate about the distribution of wealth has long been based on an abundance of prejudice and a paucity of fact. And he's saying he corrects that paucity of fact. He also says that he's responding to the laziness of others by introducing a new line of research that is at least systematic and methodological, in addition to having elements of science that are underlying it. So he's trying to set himself apart as the social scientist who's solving an ideological perspective. What I'm going to argue is that ideology actually is very dominant in what would ostensibly be the most scientific element of his project, and that is the data, that is the underlying historical claim. A few observations about Piketty's data. He is actually much bolder in his presentation than what's actually there. If you probe into the book, he doesn't really have 3 centuries worth of data. He has a few data points individually from the 18th and 19th century, but his only continuous series in the book really start around 1900 and run to the present. So to present this as like an unprecedented 3-century long data set, there's a little bit of a misnomer attached to that. Second, it isn't nearly as global as he says. He may touch upon 22 different countries at various points in the book, but it really reduces down to only a couple. The first, his best data, and I'll absolutely give him this, is from the 20th century economy of France. And this is where his research area started. Now, I'll note with a caveat on that you can evaluate the merits of basing a global theory on capitalism on the 20th century French economic policy experience. I'd say that's slightly problematic for a variety of reasons that we can get into a little bit later. But nonetheless, if the French data is the best, what else does he have to augment that? He has decent amounts of data from the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and then occasionally, although it's a distant kind of 5th place to all these countries, Sweden comes in to the picture. And then everything else, you see a rapid decline in the quality of data, and really he doesn't have good data on most of the world's major economies outside of those 5 until the late 20th century. So we're talking 1980 or 1990 and later. So there's very little limited data set to make global worldwide projections on. Then we also see there are multiple gaps and discontinuities and inconsistencies throughout his data set, which is fine, except when you try to obscure it or you cover it in the way that you present your data, and I argue very strongly that there are multiple instances of this. But first I want to start with some of the small stuff, some of the small critiques. First, Piketty is a generally horrible historian, and I say this as a historian of the United States economy, So this is closer to my own area of work and why I first investigated this book. But here's just a list of some of the things he has plain out wrong, factually wrong. For example, there's a lengthy passage in which he attributes a low, what he calls laissez-faire style tax rate of 25% to U.S. President Herbert Hoover. He's the president at the outbreak of the Great Depression, if you're not familiar with that area of history. And then he ties this into an argument that Franklin D. Roosevelt comes in during the Great Depression and very favorably and promisingly hikes taxes on the top segments of income earners in the United States. He actually has this backwards. It was really Hoover that signed the tax increase into law in 1932 before Roosevelt took office. This is just a basic fact that he is wrong. He does similar mistakes on minimum wage legislation in the U.S., so he gets the number wrong for George Bush Sr. He also credits George W. Bush, his minimum wage hike in 2007 to Barack Obama. He has gaps and missing points in his data set that just show he doesn't understand where the U.S. data comes from. For example, he traces the first U.S. estate tax to 1916. It was actually 1898, so he's missing almost 2 decades worth of data there. He has another chart where he implies that U.S. tax revenue data isn't consistently available prior to about 1910. It actually traces back to 1821 on a consistent basis, and even further if you look into individual stats. And then he has all these narrative stories that are always pinpointed to specific events. For example, the modern in rising inequality, he always stands in the 1980s Reagan-era tax cut, but none of his data points seem to match up with that line of causality that he argues with. So these are small things. Some of them are simple sloppiness rather than intentional deception. But I want to point out that these run throughout the entire book. You could probably put together dozens, if not hundreds, of similar examples across his history in other countries. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that he also has a habit of filling in the gaps in his data set without really revealing what he's doing. Here's a very simple, kind of low consequence example from the United States, and this is where he tries to derive his tax revenue returns for countries. Remember, I noted that he didn't seem to acknowledge U.S. data existed before 1910. This is digging into his data set. If you look right here, he has a percentage of national income, a percentage of GDP that's made up by tax revenue in 1910. Prior to 1910, though, you see it pivots between 7676. This isn't real data. He actually fabricated those numbers out of thin air. And you can find this by going into his formulas. What he does is he just assumes and sets 1880 at 6%, actually 6.122% if you go into the formula itself, as you see over here, and then he pivots between that by adding or subtracting basically 0.5%, so he can round up or round down for the next for the surrounding 4 decades. So this is just completely made up and inserted into his chart to make it look pretty, to make it look consistent. He didn't take the time to find the actual historical data. He just filled in numbers, and he doesn't reveal that he's doing this in any of his notes. This is a very small example, but as we see, we get bigger and bigger examples of greater consequence. I want to turn to the UK data and show you one of those examples. So this one ties into his argument. He's looking at estate tax data to show inheritance flows, basically the passing on of wealth from the elite, the richest of the rich, the wealthy class, basically from generation to generation. And he has a good data set for the United Kingdom going all the way back to 1896, and this is from another scholar, Atkinson, made these estimates. Well, he does 2 interesting things here in his chart. First, he presents the Atkinson data in decade-level averages. And those decade-level averages purport to represent what happened in the subsequent decades. So as we see over here, in this example down at the bottom, he has 1920. So his figure for 1920 is really an average of the inheritance flows from 1920 to 1929. And 1930 would be 1930 to 1939, 1940, 1940 to 1949, all the way up to the present day, which he's consistent about, except for one thing that I discovered poking around inside of his spreadsheet. That's it. If you go back to the period between 1896 and 1914, he actually backdates his average. So his average for 1900, which we see right here, is really a compilation of data from the late 1890s. And then if you jump forward to 1910, it's actually a compilation of data from the 1900s. So he's moved everything, he's shifted everything back a decade. And I want to ask the question, why do you think he does this? Well, we see it in the raw data. A big part of his argument is that at the peak of the Belle Epoque, the eve of World War I, wealth inequality and estate-based transfers of wealth were at their maximum. This is the high watermark of the Gilded Age. But if you look at the actual data from Atkinson, you see that there was already a trend underway prior to World War I of decreasing inheritance flows in the UK. So in order to circumvent that trend, and you see the raw Atkinson data are these individual data points, and then I have a corrected version using the Atkinson data. If you had used a consistent averaging methodology, that's the blue line. What Piketty actually gives us is the red line. So by backdating his data into the 1890s for those first 2 decades, he is actually able to flatten out that red line and fit his argument that World War I is actually the instigating effect of this decline in inheritance flows, where the real data shows that it was actually underway, and it's actually pretty steep for a decade or so prior to World War I. So this fits into his argument. It's a weird, consistent twist on his data set, and you notice that after World War I, things revert to normal all the way up until just a little bit of tweaks he makes in the current era. But you have a very bright and clear divergence for those first 2 decades because he's massaged his data to give him something that's closer to his argument. This is a smaller one, but things get more complex from there. There are bigger issues with Piketty. And this includes something that cuts to the core of his thesis, the wealth inequality thesis. And I want to go across several different examples from the main countries that he investigates here. 3 in particular: the United Kingdom, Sweden, and the United States. The United Kingdom is actually probably the most famous of this because it was the subject of a lengthy study that the Financial Times published back in May by Chris Giles, where they picked apart his wealth inequality curve for Great Britain in the 20th century. And notice that he goes all the way back to 1810, but he only really has 2 data points, and they're somewhat flimsy data points at that. But he's purporting to show a curve here that starting around 1900, 1910 shows a peak of wealth inequality. So this top line, what we see is the top 1% own 90% of the wealth in the UK, according to this estimate. And then fitting with his narrative, World War I and subsequent events knock that down. They obliterate the capital stock, obliterate wealth accumulation, equalize it. There's also progressive income taxes come into play, and they start having equalizing effects in distributional outcomes of those income taxes over the course of the century. So you get to the mid 20th century, around 1960, 1970 or so, you start to bottom out where wealth inequality is drastically diminished. It levels off, it kind of flattens off, but then the narrative kicks in again. 1980 and beyond, these are in the UK's case the Thatcher era liberalization of the economy, and the United States case it's the Reagan era tax cuts, individual examples in other countries. And then his argument is that you're going up from there, and he says this thing repeats in every single country he studies. Well, what Giles did is he critiqued this on a methodological ground. He said that yes, Piketty could conceivably show that, but he's cherry-picking his data. He's only selecting, of all the different methods that you could estimate wealth inequality in the UK, he's selecting the ones that fit his narrative and omitting the ones that don't. And here Giles has overlaid other studies of the same thing using different techniques that show a much more ambiguous result in the modern era. Some show pretty much a flat trend, others show slight fluctuations. They also show that there's quite a bit of disparity between where Piketty's line fits in and the raw data comes in. And you can debate whether which of these techniques is more appropriate, and there's quite a bit of discussion about that in the literature, but it's the point here is not that Giles is right and Piketty is wrong. The point here is that Giles has shown there's quite a bit more ambiguity than Piketty reveals in his data set and reveals in his work. So that's a problem. That means he's cherry-picking. That means he's selecting things that tell his story and omitting other evidence that goes against it. Well, I want to jump to another one. We see another problem. This was published actually just in the last week. Timbro did a thorough investigation of the same curve as he finds it in Sweden, and they compared his original data set against the actual years that he assigned it in the curve, and what they found is, just like some of that earlier UK data, the years didn't quite add up. In fact, he was selecting one single year and representing that as the entire decade, and he's picking the year by year that fits his narrative, that fits his curve. And we see over in this column, I've added in the actual source year data that he used compared to the decades, and we see he starts out with a small average, then he's doing on the decade, then he switches to 1935, 1945, jumps forward, again, he matches up 1950, but then we see 1960 is really 1966, 1970 is really 1975. Then things get really funny because his source data set only goes to 2006. So how do you think he gets 2010? He actually takes older data from 2006 and he massages it again and passes it off as if it's 2010. What does this do? Here's the Timbro Studies accounting of this. They find a measurement here of the disparity between what Piketty actually claims the data shows and what the raw data shows in its original form. And you find it's operating in the direction that shows this curve. So in 1980, Piketty's representation is off from his data set by over -5%. And then in 2010, he's almost 7 or 8% higher than what the data actually shows. So again, massaging the data in ways that fit his narrative. Now I want to jump to the U.S. case because this is possibly the most egregious, and it's also probably the most problematic for his argument. This chart, this is figure 10.5, it's been the one that's all over the news in the United States. Paul Krugman cited it, most of the magazines and articles on the left that favorably referred to this book use this chart to demonstrate that Piketty is right. The U shape has occurred. It bottomed out around the mid-1970s, early 1980s, and we've been on the upswing in inequality ever since. And I want you to look in particular where that arrow is pointed. There's a bottom point in 1970, and you see it on both lines. Now I want you to compare figure 10.5 to this other chart over here, and this is an older study, an older estimate of wealth inequality for the top 1%, so it overlays with the bottom curve here. This is for wealth inequality in the United States in a study that was published in 2004, and it covered basically the same era from the turn of the century to 2004. But notice something's going on over here at the end. You have a low point kind of in the 1970s. There's two things to notice here. He only has 2 data points in the 1970s in this original study, and then from there you see the trend line is actually flat, moving out toward the end of the century. You have a completely flat trend line for all intents and purposes. That's quite different than what Piketty is showing in his own data. Now, what if I were to tell you that this older study by Kopsuk and Saez was actually the root of figure 10.5? That he was getting a very different result from essentially the same data set. Things start to look a little fishy here. Well, that's in fact what he is doing, and again, he's massaged his data. Here's a raw readout of the spreadsheet, and you can see so you have the Kopsuk Saez decennial averages. They follow along in Piketty's representation, but he starts to do some funny things when you get to 1960. He starts to bring in other data points that are somewhat annotated, so he has it noted here, but they aren't fully annotated. And what you see is in 1960, he pulls in a different type of methodology, a different type of calculating wealth inequality, and he overlays it on top of the Kopsuk-Saez study and gets a different number. But then he reverts back to Kopsuk in 1970, then he reverts to another one in 1980, another in 1990 forward. What we really see here is something that I call the Frankenstein Graph. He is switching between source data based on the decade, based on the different year, to show the story that he wants to show, because the original data set, if you stuck to the same data set in Kopsuk-Saez, it actually runs contrary to his thesis. And here's how he breaks it up. Some of this is revealed, other parts are not. He switches in 1960 to a different study, switches back in 1970, switches to 2 other studies in 1980, switches to 3 other studies in 1990 and beyond. So he's using different types of data. And there are 3 key things to note here. First, the Kopsuk-Saez is really the base of his curve, and it constitutes the majority of it, but it also gives him this 1970s dip. Because it's actually light on that. There's only 2 data points, so he gets that bottom point in the 1970s, which is crucial. The second thing is that, remember, the original Kopsuk-Saez study was flat from about 1970 onward. Well, he switches to other studies that are less flat. They show an upward trend, and then he switches to an even more increased upward trend when the first of those studies, Wolf, does not bear out as much as he wants. So he's alternating between sources. The cumulative effect of this is he gets to that data point using Kopsuk-Saez with 1 intervention, and then he switches completely to different data sets from different methodologies to create the upswing that isn't there in the original data set. Now, he may have arguments of why he should do this. He has different arguments of why the more recent studies may be more accurate, but he's presenting this all as if it's the same graph. When it's really not, and his annotation is very insufficient. He reveals only a couple of these studies. For example, he doesn't note that he's performing this switch between 1950, 1960, and 1970 at all in any of the annotations, any of the spreadsheets, anything else. So this is kind of obscured and hidden. One more thing I want to note on the data sources, if you look down here, these are the different types of estimation techniques that are used. Kopsuk-Saez uses U.S. estate tax data, tax returns, to estimate wealth shares based on how much estate tax is paid in a given year. These other 2, Wolf and Kinnikel, use something called the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is a polling outfit that's run through the Federal Reserve System. What they do is they basically statistically sample people to determine how much wealth they have as a component. And it's actually a very well-regarded, rigorous survey, but it's a completely different methodology. So it gets kind of problematic when you have one consistent set, but you're switching between multiple different methodologies to fit your argument. So you may ask, didn't Piketty reply to his critics? And yes, he did. After the Financial Times episode played out, he published a lengthy reply, and some considered this to be the final word on it, and said that, the Financial Times had overstated his case, and he claimed to have answers for all of these different things. One of the claims he says is that Chris Giles in the Financial Times got it wrong on the UK data, and he makes this very extended argument that survey data is less accurate than using raw estate tax data. So in Giles's case, Giles suggested different methodologies using survey data over an estate tax estimate. So Piketty is very strongly defending using estate tax data to make his estimate for the United Kingdom. But here's the sleight of hand: when he gets to the United States, he takes the Kopsuk-Saez estate tax set, and when it doesn't show what he wants, he switches over to a survey-based Survey of Consumer Finance set from Wolf and Kinnikel to get the desired increase. So he's completely contradicted himself here when he's moved from one country to the other in his argument. The second thing he did in his response is he offered additional footnotes to explain some of those discrepancies that had come to bear, but he still didn't fully articulate or reveal what he had done, especially in that U.S. chart. And then finally, he introduces kind of a curveball to the argument. He says, there are problems with some of my charts because of incomplete data, and I admit those, but we shouldn't worry or focus on those because a new study has been released by Saez, the same Saez from the 2004 study, and one of his former PhD students, Piketty's former PhD students, Saez-Zucman at LSE, and this new study supposedly vindicates everything that he predicted in the more problematic curve, that figure 10.5 that he had in the previous graph, the Frankenstein chart. So he says, I'll defer to this new study that vindicates my results and shows that, in fact, it was even more extreme. Problem is, he doesn't reveal this at the time. This is back in May when he made this claim, this dependence on the Saez-Zucman study. It was actually just a PowerPoint slideshow that he was showing. It had never been published, hadn't been peer-reviewed. It's finally come out since then in a working paper in October 2014, but it still hasn't been reviewed by any journals or anything else. But he's claiming this as complete vindication, as if he's been proven right by a study that really doesn't exist in anything near a scientifically vetted format. I'll make a couple notes on that new study because I have a copy of it. I've looked at the data. Here's a comparison of the old Kupzik size 2004 study, the one that showed the flat line in U.S. wealth inequality all the way from the 1970s, 80s, early 1980s onward. And then he's overlaid it on this new technique. So the red line is what the new study supposedly shows, and then the green line is the Survey of Consumer Finances study by Kennekill that he used to kind of massage his data. Well, there's something interesting happening here. The new technique that Saez and Zucman use actually parallels almost perfectly the old 2004 data set until the early to mid 1980s. And it also for the limited amount that we have the Survey of Consumer Finances study, it parallels it at first for a while as well. But then you see two things happening. And the first is right after 1985, you have a massive divergence that's emerging between the older study and this supposed new technique. And then after about 1990, you have the same thing, a massive divergence between the older survey study and the supposed new technique for estimating everything. This tells me one thing about the new technique. Its previous validity has been vindicated somewhat by paralleling the older line. Up until this point, something is going skewy in its model after around the mid-1980s to early 1990s that's causing a divergence from older tested techniques that's not adequately represented or explained in the study itself, the new study by Saez and Zucman. So this is something they're going to have to answer for, but it's enough for me to ask the question, are you overstating the significance of your result, and why did these previous studies not see the trend that you are now claiming is so pronounced? Well, we get an answer to that somewhat in Piketty's spin on this new study. And what we find out is it's really all about his policy prescription and justifying that prescription. It's all about raising taxes. So this is a summary of his interpretation when back in 2003, 2004, when that first data set came out and it looked like there was a flat line for U.S. wealth inequality. He says, this is basically the vindication of heavy progressive income taxes and estate taxation that we've had over the past half century because they have prevented the reconstitution of the rentier capital stock in the wake of the wars. So he's happy. He's celebrating income taxes, and he says it's proven in a flat line for U.S. wealth inequality. Well, now he's got a new study that shows that flat line, or purports to show that flat line, was actually increasing for the exact same years. What's his interpretation? This proves we need more heavy income tax policies, and we need more heavy estate taxation to prevent the reconstitution of the rentier capital stock. So he's completely taken two divergent data sets that show different things for the same era and reached the same conclusion out of them. We need more taxes. This tells me the policy prescription is driving everything in his data interpretation. He's letting that desire for higher taxes guide the way that he interprets the data points in his data results. This may raise another question, and we've seen evidence of this. Did Piketty intentionally manipulate his data sources to support this policy claim? We're going to make two interpretations. First, the wealth inequality errors, as we've seen, they might be attributable, and reasonably so, to sloppiness in some cases. He also seems to exercise confirmation bias in picking data points that support his argument and ignoring others. So it's kind of a cherry-picking approach. But it's hard to say that he overtly and intentionally biased his results. I mean, there are plausible cases that he could have picked those data points that show what he wants to show, but it's ambiguous. It's methodological. It comes down to a choice in different perspectives. There's a more problematic element, though, because there's another case where his evidence is far more egregious and suggests that he actually did engage in intentional manipulation to get support for his thesis. I want to go back to the theoretical point at the beginning of the article. Remember this famous formula, R is greater than G. Capital accumulation will tend to, over time in capitalist economies, outpace the growth rate of that economy. Therefore, you get the rentier, capital accumulating, wealthy class and an emerging disparity of income. Well, he attempts to prove this, and he goes about it several ways, but one of the key ones is he tries to measure the world capital stock. So an overall estimate of how much capital is privately owned in the world, and he pairs it up against national income. So we have this another famous figure that's widely cited in the book. It appears at 2 different points tied to this argument. It's figure 12.4, where he claims to show the world capital stock, private capital stock, as a ratio to accumulated national income, so the GDP of the world, basically. So what's he doing here? Well, it fits his argument. You have an increase in the capital stock to the Belle Epoque, right on the eve of World War I. The war hits, it decimates the privately owned capital stock. You have another series of events. The Great Depression hits, another war hits, and then by mid-20th century, you have a massive bottoming out of the world capital stock as a ratio to income. And he traces this forward, then he says there's a rebound, and he goes all the way to 2010, and then from 2010 onward, he forecasts the direction, the trajectory, all the way up the curve of the capital income ratios for the world. And his narrative is, we're headed straight back to the Gilded Age and beyond. We're headed back to a capital income ratio that's even more extreme than the Gilded Age, and this will also, by implication, and as it filters through, carry a trend of rising upward wealth inequality with it, and all the bad things he says that will happen in relation to that. That's his theory, and here's the data point in the chart to prove it out. So my question to you, where does he get the evidence that compiles this chart? Where does he get his world capital to income ratio? Where does he get capital stock data for the world? Well, I decided to investigate this, and I started probing around again inside of his spreadsheets, his underlying data sources. And this is what I found. Missing data points abound. These are his estimates of the capital to income, capital to national income ratios for different regions of the world, based on the countries that compose those different regions, from 1870 up until the present. Everything in white he has an actual estimate from, and these are derived from government sources, tax sources, other studies that other scholars have done. I have reason to believe that they're fairly representative, that they're accurate. Everything in pink is a guesstimation. It's made up. It does not exist. Data does not bear any of this out. He simply doesn't have it. And he admits in his footnotes that he doesn't have most of this data in some of the key cases. He says, you know, we simply don't have records for these different countries. We don't know what the capital income stock of India was in 1870. So I'm going to put in what I consider to be a reasonable guesstimation. And he goes back and he fills this in. Notice that this is most of the world. It's not the largest economies, which are in Western Europe and North America, but it is the remainder of the world. This is a pretty sizable stock. You're talking anywhere between 25 and 40% of the world economy in a given year is represented in the pink, represented in something that he simply makes up. So this becomes immediately problematic because he's filling in data points and making a very bold data claim on them where they don't exist. It gets a little bit better at the tail end of the 20th century. You start to get good data for Japan and Australia, New Zealand, but really all he has for the full data set is North America and Western Europe. Everything else in pink, completely made up. Guesstimation. Well, that's not the only guesstimation involved. He takes all those data points in that series and he applies a weighted average across them because he's got to decide how much of the world economy is represented in Western Europe at that given point in time. Therefore, when I make this compiling, when I make this average summary line for the world, how much do I weight the Western Europe term? How much do I weight North America? So he has estimations of the world output distribution across all of these different regions as well. And you can see here we start in 1870. Europe owned 46% or produced 46% of the world's output. North America is 12%, and it changes over time as you'd expect. Well, again, the white data points are actually accurate. They actually have some basis in reality. The yellow ones, they aren't made up, but he's done something that we call interpolation. He's projected a consistent straight trend line across the years that he doesn't have data points to create continuity. And as you can see, he's going multiple decades in succession where he doesn't have any calibration point. And the older his data gets, the more decades he jumps. When we get into the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, he has a good data point every 20 years. But we're talking 30, 40 years that are skipped over in the early part of his data set. And one in particular I want to call your attention to with these two eras. Huge gap between 1910 and 1950. And if you actually get his calibration points, he only uses two specific years. So over here we have 1913, that's actually his calibration point for 1910, and then we have a data point for 1950, that's his calibration point for 1950. You have a huge 37-year gap between that. Now what happened, mind you, between 1913 and 1950? Think about that from world history. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. AKA the very same events that Piketty argues obliterated the world capital stock. Do you think it's not the slightest bit problematic that he has a gap in his calibration points in the exact same years that his argument is playing out, that the core of his argument is playing out? I think that's something that's at least worth considering. So he's made a very substantial leap here. Again, is this laziness? Is this error of inconsistency? Probably so. Is it intentional manipulation? Maybe, but I'm going to argue, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But I will say one other thing is indeed intentional manipulation. Let's go back to that original source chart. Remember the everything in pink? Keep that in your mind. I'm going to jump forward. Exact same chart. Looks a little bit different now. Everyone notice that? There are three columns where you have substantial amounts of made-up data asserted, inserted into the chart, and they're highlighted in red. Notice the corresponding years and the corresponding regions of the world: Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. And notice that his estimations, or guesstimations, drop very radically in those years for all three of those regions. So instead of assuming a 3-to-1 ratio of the capital stock to national income, or a 2-to-1 ratio as elsewhere in the world, he drops it to parity, 100%. So there's a 1-to-1 capital income ratio in these three specific regions in this chart. What do you think is going on there? Pay attention to the dates. There's your answer. He has very quietly inserted communist assumptions into his data set for a chart about capital. What is that assumption, basically? He is accepting the communist ideological line from an a priori position. That is, a communist society has eliminated private capital ownership and reduced it to parity in, I guess, the workers' paradise, everything that you'd anticipate there. Therefore, we have no capital to income ratio in these countries. Therefore, we can assume that it evens out at parity, or 1-to-1, or in this representation, 100%. Soviet Union kicks in 1920 and lasts until the end of the 1980s, so basically the fall of the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe, he kicks in 1950, it's actually 1945, but since he's representing by decades, it goes all the way up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And China kicks in 1949, really 1950 in his chart, and traces all the way up to the liberalization of trade in the 1980s in China. That he has this assumed communist data point in his source data set. Now, I want to note something about this. This is not annotated. It's not revealed in any of his methodology notes. It's not in any of his footnotes, not in any of his appendices. It's not even revealed in the straight-up data set. It's actually buried in there. You've got to go through three separate spreadsheets of data to find that he did this. He did not reveal one word of justification why he made this assumption about the communist world vis-a-vis everywhere else. I'm going to argue that, yeah, that's probably intentional, and it has a very clear effect. Here's the effect teased out. The points that he actually has real data on, again, are Western Europe and North America for the entire century. And I've graphed them here individually to show how they play out. And notice we actually have two very different trends. Western Europe does indeed follow the U shape over the course of the century. I'll give him that. The question of why is an open matter of discussion. Notice that the majority of activity comes in one single decade, that's World War I, quite possibly because World War I is fought heavily in the middle of Western Europe. But we have data to support this U. So you have a stable 650% capital stock, so 6.5 to 1 up until World War I, then it's knocked down, and then you have a bit of the U, and then there's some recovery. But look at the North American data, raw North American data. It's actually a completely opposite trend. It's a flat line for the entire century. It hovers either just north of or just south of 4 to 1. Now, there are some blips in that line, so say the Great Depression and Roaring Twenties play out. So there's a blip in that line. There's World War II. There's another blip in that line. But if I were to fit a trend line to the North American data, it's flat across the entire century. It would have a slope of near zero. So it doesn't fit my U at all. It's, in fact, a very contradictory thesis that's playing out in North America that is at odds with Piketty's assumption. So what does this mean? If I were to compile these two independent lines together in a chart, I would see some counteracting effect caused by the North American data on the Western European data. In other words, it would average it out. It would flatten out the overall trend line for these two data sets, the two regions of the world brought together in a single chart. Yet we know from Piketty's chart he has the exact opposite being shown. He shows a global trend line that's accentuated. It looks something like this. Where that's the original chart, the black line, the world trend line, and notice it follows the U perfectly as he describes. And what I've overlaid it with is the communist data point assumptions and when they kick in. 1920, 1950 moves on over here, and then we have a gradual liberalization as the communist world falls after 1990. So by inserting that one-to-one parity for the communist world across this entire chart, what does he get? He gets an automatic built-in downward pull into his average. And it peaks really at 1950, which is coincidentally, well, actually not coincidentally at all, although he'd want you to believe that, the bottom point of his curve. So at the height of the Soviet Union, at the height of the Eastern Bloc, at the height of Maoist takeover of China, he has this heavily exerted downward pull in the world economy. Really, it's almost a fifth of the world economy is represented here as being at parity, and he averages it into his chart, and what does it do? It pulls the U downward and gives him the story he wants for the 20th century. This is problematic. So was it an intentional deception? Here, I'm going to make the case that it probably is. First, an explanation for any of these communist data point assumptions, as I noted, simply does not appear anywhere in Piketty's texts, footnotes, or data appendices. It's completely buried in there. It's hidden. It's actually hard-coded into his source data underneath the chart, and it's buried in 3 spreadsheets deep to even find that he did this with the communist world. And again, when you get 3 spreadsheets deep, you find absolutely no annotation or revelation that he did this. The inclusion has the effect of taking 2 divergent trends and merging them into a single pronounced U-shape that supports his R is greater than G thesis. And then finally, I'll ask the question, why would you include any communist data in a chart that is supposed to demonstrate a behavioral law about capitalism? Aren't you violating your assumptions? And he has no answer for that, or has not proffered any that I'm aware of. So what does it mean? Let's get to a couple concluding thoughts, then I'd be happy to entertain any questions. First, I'll note that Piketty's entire argument is rife with errors. Many of them are small, but a few of the larger ones are significant. We can attribute some of these, as I noted, to sloppiness, cherry-picking, confirmation bias. He gets the story that he wants, but he also does seem to consciously massage his data in a consistent direction that always comes out in favor of his argument and never seems to recognize the ambiguities that go against his argument. So that's problematic. That's confirmation bias, at least. But then we get to 2 very large errors that fall into different categories. One is his wealth inequality data across multiple different countries is very problematic on a case-by-case basis in the sense that he is selectively picking data that shows his case and selectively ignoring data that goes against his case. What we really have is at best ambiguous data of conflicting trends. What he tries to turn that into is pronounced data that only supports the trend he wants to see. Second, you get to that larger issue of the capital stock data, the R is greater than G. You get this global index that is actually distorted by the Soviet Union and other communist countries at mid-century, with actually no revelation in Piketty's work that this is indeed going on. Rather, what it is a constructed U-shaped chart to support his argument, to sync up with his narrative that comes from bad data and data that probably should not have been included in that chart. And cumulative, the effect of this is to show that growing wealth inequality is severely overstated vis-a-vis what's really existent in data points that we actually have, and to show that the U-shaped capital income ratio, and thus his core argument, R is greater than G globally, is a willful manipulation, or at least appears to be a willful manipulation to produce that desired result. Therefore, I would argue that the faults in his data, taken cumulatively, are enough to cast ambiguity upon his claims, and then in the particular of his core thesis, as R is greater than G, completely discredit it as a contrivance that's a result of this insertion of communist data points into his product. With that, it draws into question some severe issues about the accuracy and forthrightness and reliability of his scholarship that I would argue completely undermine the credibility of his core thesis and his book. With that, I'd be happy to take questions. I have a couple links up here as well where I've explained some of the data things, points that I've gone through, because I know I went through them very quickly. They are actually covered on my blog, and I'm working on an article that summarizes this as well. And there's also my email if you wish to contact me at IHS about this topic or really any of our programs. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Myself, I am amazed with hearing all this, and I'm receiving questions. Everyone can ask their question by typing them in the question box, and then I will read them out to Dr. Magness. I have a first question from Rock, which is quite long, but I will read it out entirely. What is your view of how Piketty deals with the question of risk? To me, it appears he completely ignores risk and just assumes capital grows itself. Additionally, he also seems to disregard that capital management is not just subject to risk, but also means adding value. In other words, the rentiers, as he calls them, are actually doing something which adds value to society. They seem like glaring and obvious holes in the basic premise of his theory. So, am I missing? Yeah.
I would agree absolutely. Now, that is a theoretical argument as opposed to a data argument, so it fits into the other component of his overall thesis. That's the first line of it. But yeah, I say absolutely he's missing value created by both capital owners, including even the rentiers. He's also missing an entrepreneurial function that's connected to that. There's actually a paper that came out in the last week or two that asked the question, where is the entrepreneur in Piketty? Entrepreneurship is inherently an action of uncertainty. It's inherently an action that assumes some sort of risk associated with the expenditure and allocation of money, including capital allocations. That's missing from his story because he assumes the static state that's built around the transfer of wealth by inheritances of the capital stock. So yeah, he's missing a huge part of his picture in his overall thesis, and that's an entirely valid critique I'd add on top of all the data points.
Thank you. Then I have another question from Bill, and Bill asks, does Piketty do much to explain the accuracy of the income data from 1900 to 1950 or 1960? I've heard that it's difficult to assume that IRS data is accurate during this period of time because people hit lots of money. How much does he ensure that he's accounting for this factor?
Right. Well, this is hugely problematic for a variety of reasons. Yeah, you're absolutely right that so wealth inequality period is very difficult to measure because you can only really go at it two ways. One is to use something based on tax data. The other is to ask people by a survey. Tax data doesn't account for tax evasion or hidden wealth. Survey data doesn't account for lying or revealing something other than what you actually own. These are both problematic because they introduce uncertainty, they introduce a level of error into the overall trend line. Piketty is aware of this, and he defers to it in some of his data appendices when he's answering his critics. The problem is he pivots between acknowledging awareness of this flaw, acknowledging awareness of this this error, and then making these very, very bold, aggressive data claims, such as he's absolutely certain that this U-shaped pattern plays out. He's absolutely certain that wealth inequality is on the rise after dissipating at mid-century. So he's trying to have both ways in his argument. He's saying, yes, the data is ambiguous, it's not perfect, it has these underlying flaws that we have to account for, but I'm going to make my claim anyway. So engaging in that pivot allows him to basically sidestep the issue and therefore jump straight forward to his bold policy conclusion, which is he wants higher income taxes. You know, that example I cited, so back in 2004 when he thought the data showed it was flat, he still wanted higher income taxes because they created the flatness. In 2014, now he thinks the data shows that inequality is increasing. Same interpretation. He wants more income taxes to correct that inequality.
I have another question from Jacob, and Jacob's question is, how exactly does Piketty use the U shape to prove that R is greater than G? Because that thesis falls away now apparently because the U shape wasn't there, at least in the US.
Right, right. So he obscures the U.S. case. He actually does have the U.S. data disaggregated in a different chart, but he tries to argue just based on eyeballing the chart that there is a very subtle U in it. It's simply not there. If you take any century-long look at it, though, like I could fit a trend line that shows this is not there. You have fluctuations to either side around a stable trend. But nonetheless, he tries to eyeball it and says, yes, there's a more subtle U in the U.S., and it's insulated because we didn't have wars fought on the U.S. homeland, so therefore you don't have the decimation effect of World War I and World War II playing out. So that according to his claim, explains why this U is not here or not as pronounced in the U.S. I'd argue it's not there at all. He'd say it's just more subtle and needs to be teased out of or massaged out of the data. But he also then he goes about obscuring that because he tries to blend it into this world chart with European data and, without telling us, Soviet and other communist data that gives a very, very pronounced U that kind of coincides at mid-century. Now notice there are a couple implications of this to his story. So he has this R is greater than G thesis that counts upon the obliteration of the capital stock. Well, what obliterated the capital stock? War and depression. If you accept his arguments, is it not true by implication that war, the effects of World War I and II are being celebrated as a good thing for obliterating the capital stock? Is it also not true, since he's building communist data points into his set to get the result, that he is, by inference, saying something favorable about there being a very large segment of the world under communism at mid-century? I don't think he'd overtly make that claim, but I would say it's an intuitive implication of everything that he's suggesting with that U-shape.
A question from Christian, and he asks if the manipulation of data sources, is that something you see more and more in the social sciences? And if so, does this say anything about the limit of statistics and that social scientists are trying to bound them to prove more than they actually can?
Sure. I think it's certainly a fair question. As I mentioned, I'm a historian, a policy historian by training, which means I do dabble in quite a bit of statistical methodology. My background expertise is in U.S. tax policy and U.S. tax data and trade data, mostly in the 19th century, but 19th or early 20th century. That's how I first got into Piketty. A colleague told me, he said, "You're a tax data guy for the 19th century U.S. You ought to read this book because it talks about 19th century tax data." Things didn't add up between what I knew to be true and what Piketty was claiming about the same data sets. The peril here is when you go into long macro historical data sets covering centuries or more, you get increasingly sparse data points, or at minimum, it gets harder to aggregate. it's hard to put together a 200-year data set on macroeconomic indicators for a single country, let alone the world. It's hard to put together a 100-year data set for the world. So steps are being taken to get around some of those inadequacies of the data. Sometimes it's simply a missing point here or there. Maybe there's a decade or two that are missing, so you have to work through them. You have to interpolate through them. That is generally, it's an accepted technique. It's a valid technique insofar as you indicate that you're doing it. You reveal that you're doing it. Piketty is less than forthright about doing that. He's very opaque in the way that he annotates where he's making jumps, where he's making assumptions over gaps in the data points. So I'd say the effect of this is he's making stronger claims than his data can support. I would not say we should throw out data techniques entirely from the social sciences. They're quite useful. I'd say that historians tend to be more attentive to the year-to-year fluctuations as opposed to the overall trends, and that's why you get a diversion between someone like Piketty, who's coming at this as an economist, and someone like myself or some of the other historians that have written on this and looked and found, year-to-year data gaps are a big problem. Especially if they overlay something like World War I and World War II, which one of the examples I went through did. Its attentiveness to detail needs to temper kind of the data reliance, and that'd be essentially where I stand on that issue.
And then maybe the last question from Joshua. I think I have several other questions, but I think mainly they were answered already. If not so, just send me something and then I can still ask them. So Joshua's question: in his projection for further inequality, does Piketty give a confidence interval for his projection? Also,
No.
Also, are there any papers to cite pointing out Piketty's errors?
Yeah. So the first question on the confidence interval, no, it's a very back of the envelope projection technique. First thing I looked to when I saw that he was doing forecasting, so the question that comes to mind is he doing an ARIMA model. This is a standard econometric technique for forecasting data points into the futures. Autoregressive integrated moving average is a recycled smoothing technique that takes previous data points and attempts to extrapolate an upward trend, or really a range of trends where you have an interval associated with them. He doesn't do this at all. This is simply back of the envelope projecting. He tries to guesstimate where he thinks the capital stock of the world will be in a given year based on various capital asset data points that he has and assumed rates of return. And then just multiplies them in there and projects forward in a very straightforward line. So it's not very sophisticated at all as a forecasting technique. I think that further undermines where he's going with his data on top of where he came from the historical points in his data. The second question: are there papers critiquing this coming out? Yes, there are several in the works. Several have been put up online on the theoretical side. There's a paper by Darren Asimoglu that's on SSRN and NBER, I believe, that critiques the underlying problems of Piketty's theory. I have my own paper that's going after a model. The data points that were summarized in this article. It should be coming out sometime in the spring, and the Journal of Private Enterprise is the venue for that. But it's a paper in the works that's going to take everything that I've got together in this presentation and put it in an academic setting. And then again, if you look to the link down here on the bottom of this last slide, the tag under Thomas Piketty, this shows all the different blog articles that summarize the different components of that. So if you want to dig into it a little bit deeper, see where I'm going, see the charts that are referenced, and check it out for yourself, I fully invite that. And it's there for you. It's open and available. But hold tight for a couple months, and we will have something in print.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magness. Thank you also for attending. We had a lot of people here tonight. We had great questions, and it was a great lecture overall. We will soon put this lecture on YouTube, so you can, if you want to look to the data again, you can watch it again.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Thank you all, and see you on the next webinar.